Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Dr. Nana. Let me begin by welcoming everybody to our webinar. My name is Dr. Ndoripula Hamtuma, the chairperson of NAMSCORE Sport Consulting. I'm delighted to be the moderator for this very important discussion, which is titled Testosterone and Women's Sport and the Way Forward, the Understanding and the Way Forward for Africa. I am equally delighted that we are joined by renowned scholars, athletes of the world. We are also joined by various academics, various sport practitioners, and many, many familiar faces that are currently on the line that have joined us. And I just want to welcome everybody. We are also joined by two important guests, and that is Professor Katrina Karkazis and also Dr. Payoshni Mitra, who is also part of this conversation. As I said, my role is really to moderate this session and allow me to introduce the host of the webinar, who is Dr. Nana Adam Oboyagi, who happened to be a fellow alumni from the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Nana is a postdoctorate fellow at the Center for Sport Leadership at Marty Sport at Stellenbosch University. She holds a PhD in sport management from the University of Johannesburg and currently the vice chairperson of the South Africa Sport Confederation and Olympic Committee Education and Culture Commission. Dr. Nana's research focus on areas on gender equality, women in sport, and sport-related and gendered policy. So I'm very, very delighted, Dr. Nana, to have you as our host. And without wasting further ado, please take over the webinar and host this important discussion. Thank you, Nana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamutuma. And a very warm welcome to all of you who are tuning into this webinar today from across the globe. I would like to actually begin by providing some context into how this webinar came about. After the news of Christina Mboma and Beatrice Masilingi came out, Dr. Hamutuma actually reached out to me because, as he said, we were supervised during our PhDs at the University of Johannesburg by Professor Cora Burnett. So when this story came out, he reached out to me and he said two things. He said, Nana, what can we do about this and how can we help? The reason I mentioned this is that Dr. Hamutuma recognized that women in sport issues, simply put, are sport issues. And that is why we are actually all online today, because a man recognized the need to raise the profile and support a woman's issue whilst also letting the women lead on the issue. So thank you for that, Dr. Hamutuma. Now, before we begin, I would just like to touch on some housekeeping points. The first one is those who sent their questions during registration, the questions were actually shared with our speakers, and they've tried to incorporate most of the questions into their presentations. However, there will be some questions which will, of course, not be covered, but we do have a list as well of questions which came in later on. So for those of you who want to listen to the presentation and then have the opportunity to ask questions, you'll have the opportunity through our chat or the Q&A function in the Zoom that you can post your questions to myself or Dr. Hamutuma, and our speakers will respond to your questions after they have both presented. So we will incorporate questions which were asked beforehand and which will be asked during the presentations, and we will present them to our speakers after everyone has presented. We will try our best to answer all the questions if time allows, so please be patient. And if you feel your questions were not answered during this webinar, we'll try our best to get back to you as well. And finally, we are aware as hosts and panelists of this webinar that the topic under discussion tonight is very, very sensitive and that there are different views and opinions on the matter. So as a host, I humbly request that respect prevails throughout this webinar with respect to any comments made or any questions which are posed to our guest speakers. So that's all I ask, respect until the end of this webinar from all attendees. So with that said, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Katrina Karkazis. Professor Karkazis is a cultural anthropologist and bioethicist who examines medical scientific beliefs about gender, sexuality, and the body. Her first book, Fixing Sex, Intersex Medical Authority and Lived Experience, explored controversies over medical interventions for people with intersex traits. This was followed by research and advocacy on sex testing of elite women athletes. Her latest co-authored book, Testosterone, an Unauthorized Biography, was published by Harvard University Press. She was also an expert witness in Duty Chan's successful appeal of testosterone regulations at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is also known as CAS, and she consulted with Caster Semenya's team prior to her hearing at CAS. She has also consulted with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights regarding sex and gender discrimination in sport, and was a co-author of the Human Rights Watch report, They're Chasing Us Away from Sport, Human Rights Violations in Sex Testing of Elite Women Athletes. So a very warm welcome to you, Professor Karkazis, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I'll now hand over to you for your presentation, and you are enabled to share your screen with us.
Lovely. It's nice to see everyone, and Drs. Hamutuma and Dr. Adam Oboyagi, thank you so much for having me. Nice to see you, Payoshni, again. And I feel very privileged to be with this audience and to come together to discuss what is, quite frankly, a set of egregious human rights violations of women from the Global South. So what I'd like to do today, I did prepare some slides, and I prepared them in part looking at the questions that people sent and thinking, what could I provide here that might shift the focus away from where it typically goes in many conversations about these regulations, which is to science. And I think science in many ways is a diversion, and conversations about science is really a diversion from what's happening here. So I'm going to take you through a really quick tour of some things that I've been thinking about over the last 10 or so years that I've been working on this topic. So if you give me 1 second. So where I'd actually like to start, because someone asked this, is, how do we know when someone is male or female, or what is it that determines sex that enables categorization of people? And this might seem an unusual place to start because people typically start with the science. But what I'd actually like to start with actually is the racialized history of the sex binary, so that the full notion that there are distinct and non-overlapping bodies that take the frame of sort of male and female is actually an idea that emanates from colonial and white supremacist ideologies. And if you think about this for a second, when people were thinking about division, really, that there were sort of only two distinct or opposite sexes, this created a problem in part because if people are grouped only along the lines of sex in some way, and it's not racialized, then you would have Caucasian women and women of color seemingly on the same level in the societal hierarchy. And this became a problem in terms of, colonial projects and other things. So the idea was actually that it wasn't just a male-female division, but that it was a racialized male-female division. And so scientists argued at this time that white people were superior because in a way they were more sexually differentiated. So bigger differences between males and females among white people who were at the top of the hierarchy, and then everyone else was clustered in different places, but always beneath sort of white bodies and biologies. And indeed, in some cases, the thought was that actually there were not gender or sex distinguishing features among people of color, but it was kind of an undifferentiated body. So one of the really important things about this ideology really is the idea of, almost to the point of being different species, that males and females are utterly different throughout the body. So that in the 19th century, what you started to see was scientists looking at skeletons, scientists looking at genitalia, scientists looking at other kinds of physiological features like hormones, and trying to show that it was very much a difference mentality. And even though we know that there's an extraordinary amount of similarity from people that we now call male and female, the focus here was a difference model. And so every piece of research that they did sought to uncover that difference and emphasize it. And so just to give you a sense of some of this racialized thinking, a very important German sexologist wrote in 1886, the higher the development of the race, the stronger the contrast between men and women. And another important scientist, the less civilized the race, the less is the physical differences of the sexes. So I just want to give that as a background because it becomes very important in our contemporary conversations. And I want to alert you to at least one book, which is done, it's a brilliant book called The Invention of Women. She looks at the way in which this colonial thinking affected gender ideology in Yoruba lands. And so I highly recommend this for a deep dive into some of this thinking around a particular time and space in Africa. So what happened from this point, if we think about this difference model, is that scientists, biologists, and others began to scour the body for how you could sort of locate the difference between males and females. How might we know? And in the long century, through the late 1800s, through all of the 1900s, there's been this focus and incredible obsession really with finding difference. And part of what that has done is it's resulted in a multiplicity of sex markers in the body, so that there is not one single trait that you can look at to categorize all people as male or female. Instead, there will be some here that you probably recognize: chromosomes, gonads, hormones, genitalia, internal reproductive organs. And what scientists argued was that all of these traits, these sex-linked traits, would be in concordance in any particular body. But what we know over time is that that's not the case. And there's an incredible amount of diversity. Not only are all of these traits that I've mentioned up above not binary, meaning there's more than two versions, but in fact, they're not all concordant within the same individual. And so the upshot of this is that the breadth of human physical variation is far more complex, and that these categories that we use socially and legally very often actually encompass a broad range of physiological differences among humans. So that brings us to sex testing, because in the early 1900s, when women were introduced, and most especially Caucasian women, as being allowed to compete in elite sport, it created a problem. If you had all of these physiological factors, which one would you use to categorize and define sex? And this became an abiding preoccupation of sport policymakers going all the way back to the 1930s. And at first it was more informal and an ad hoc interest, but always focused on women with intersex variations, with the idea that they somehow problematized an already problematic binary. And so what they did over time was to variously select some of those markers that I told you. So relying on physical form and shape, right? So looking at people's particular bodies as they were nude and deciding whether those people were male or female, looking at the chromosomal status, which we typically understand to be XX and XY, but actually there are far more variations than that. And it was a constant roulette wheel, if you will, of trying to identify a physiological trait. And eventually, after much politicking and advocacy, interestingly enough, from policymakers themselves, some of the key sports governing bodies, including what is now World Athletics, and shortly thereafter, the International Olympic Committee, decided to stop mandatory testing of all women. They always had a reserve clause that would allow them to investigate women that they deemed suspicious. So the problem with sex testing across this very long multi-decades period is not that you couldn't test for the trait. It was completely possible to test for chromosomes. The problem was an ideological one, which was the assumption that any singular trait would allow you to classify all people as male or female. And women athletes have always been the ones who have been investigated. So there has never been an analogous regulation for men, in part because of patriarchal ideology that men are always already superior athletes. And so we must protect, and I use that sort of advisedly, the women's category from anybody who they believe doesn't belong in that category, who they thought might infiltrate that category in order to dominate. So why the testosterone regulations? The mandatory regulations for all women were abandoned in 1991 and 2000 by the larger sports governing bodies. But starting really around the time that Caster Semenya was targeted in Berlin, there started to be a new conversation about whether or not there should be a new marker. And initially, the focus was once again on intersex women and whether or not they should be included in sport. And this very quickly shifted to a focus on testosterone, in part because an intersex advocate was at these meetings and said that you have to stop discriminating against us and targeting us. And so testosterone became a really convenient biomarker that was adopted by the sports governing bodies as a way in their minds to differentiate male and female. A quick historical side note is that this isn't the first time that testosterone was proposed. In fact, when sports governing bodies initially began discussing getting rid of the mandatory sex testing regulations, some global north white women athletes proposed testosterone as the newest marker, and it was rejected by the policymakers precisely for the reasons that it's problematic today. And I will go through some of that. So very quickly, in kind of a gross sketch, because there's been a lot of permutations of these policies over the last 10 years, kind of what's the rationale or what's going on here? So the idea is that there's an observed difference in performance between men and women, and that is most likely due to higher testosterone levels, and that women with naturally higher testosterone levels, so these are not women who have been doping, there's a lot of variability among humans' testosterone levels, and that women with higher levels would have an unfair advantage over their fellow competitors with lower levels. And so what sports policymakers did is they created a threshold or a ceiling for testosterone levels. And this threshold has fluctuated over time, and over time has gotten lower. And the idea was that any woman who had testosterone above this particular level must lower it. And they were adamant that this was not another version of sex testing, right? That this was kind of a science-based approach that was grounded in the scientific literature about the relationship between testosterone and athleticism. So from the very earliest regulations, I like to keep going back to these because I think they're really revealing about the mindset and the thinking behind the regulations. And what we'll see when they're speaking about, so IAAF is, you probably are all already know this, but anyway, they now have rebranded themselves as World Athletics. So I'm speaking about the same organization here. For women with high testosterone, this is from the policy itself, the individuals concerned often display masculine traits and have an uncommon athletic capacity in relationship to their fellow competitors. So you already see in this kind of thinking a focus on women who are deemed to be too masculine. And what that actually might be at any particular point is a deeply subjective idea, but one that is informed by the cultural norms of white people in the global north, who are overwhelmingly the policymakers that have been involved in, overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, the policymakers who have been involved in making these policies. And not to leave out the International Olympic Committee, they had two quick statements for 2012 and 2014 Olympics. Usually intersex athletes can be placed in the male-female group on the basis of their legal sex. However, as explained below, intersex female athletes with elevated androgen production, which is a synonym more or less for testosterone, give rise to a particular concern in the context of competitive sports. So once again, focus on women with intersex variation. That is an almost at this point, close to century-long focus and targeting of women with intersex variations. So what's the upshot? I think we all know that we have legal documents that reflect our social categorization. We have our lived experience and identity. And yet none of this is sufficient for eligibility for women athletes, that this gets disregarded as though there is some more direct biological truth that speaks to the actual sex of the person seeking to compete. And therefore, testosterone is a proxy not only for masculine advantage, which is what they called it, but for masculinity and even manliness and maleness itself. And what I've argued is that it's a really convenient criterion because there's a lot of mythology about testosterone, what it does, and especially what it does to women. And that what the sports governing bodies did is pick a physiological trait that seemed commonsensical to a lot of people, that many people believe and continue to believe that testosterone is a male sex hormone, which is actually a misnomer in terms of what we understand about this hormone, that it is exclusive or else more potent in men, but simultaneously, there is a widespread belief that testosterone is the driver of athleticism. So when these two widespread types of thinking about T being a male hormone and the driver of athleticism come together, it seemed like a very plausible and scientifically based way to differentiate people in terms of women's eligibility. So is there advantage? I want to say very little about this. I'm going to give you some really high level ideas, but I've written about this in many different places, and please feel free to reach out to me if you want a bit more about this. But what I'd like to say is some of this is explored in the book that I did with my colleague, Rebecca Jordan-Young, that is all about testosterone, and there's a chapter in there on athleticism, that it's important to know that there are almost no studies of testosterone and its relationship to athleticism in women. One of the reasons for this is that it wasn't thought to be important. So we have almost no studies, even outside of sport, on the role of testosterone, even in women's health and well-being, but we know it's important for that. There's no evidence showing that successful athletes have higher endogenous, which is a synonym for natural testosterone, than less successful athletes. You can't rank athletes by their testosterone level, and you absolutely cannot assume that those who win have the highest levels. People have different responses to the same amounts of testosterone. Another fun fact is that even though testosterone is important for anabolic muscle development, all of the receptors in the muscles in our body are not the same, so that your quadriceps muscles can have different levels of testosterone sensitivity than your trapezius muscles. So this is to say that the science of testosterone is incredibly complex, and testosterone is one element in a complex neuroendocrine feedback system, but it's also one element in really what it takes to become an excellent athlete. I want to be clear that what I'm not saying is that testosterone doesn't matter at all. It absolutely matters, but that you can't assume a kind of volumetric assessment where the more testosterone you have, or anyone has, the better that they will necessarily do. It just doesn't work that way. And the literature points to a positive relationship between testosterone and athleticism, a neutral relationship, and a negative relationship, by which I mean that there are studies that show that people with lower testosterone do better in some physical feats. Okay, so really quickly then, something happened yesterday where the sports, it's important to know that the vast majority of the so-called evidence for these regulations was collected after they were enacted and was based on one study put out in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that was done by the policymakers themselves, right? So not an assessment of the larger body of research on testosterone and athleticism, but studies done on athletes, done by the policymakers themselves. And yesterday, after that particular study, which came out in 2017, had been widely and roundly critiqued since 2017, and 2 weeks after the Tokyo Olympics, they've acknowledged that there is no confirmatory evidence for causality in the observed relationships reported. So they tried to make a claim that there was in some cases they said it was correlational, in some cases they said it was causal. So very often they were arguments of convenience, dependent upon how careful they wanted to be at the time. But that the relationship between testosterone and athleticism essentially was not causal. The timing of this is incredibly interesting. It's certainly not an accident. It is deeply unfortunate that this statement came out because it's some of the only evidence that they've put forth besides some what I would call observational evidence. And it comes at a time where they've already started to make announcements that right now, these regulations, at least for world athletics, are limited from the 400 meter to 1 mile. And they've said lately that they will expand the events which are regulated. And my guess is that the 200 is the one, that's the one they've mentioned. It's not a guess at all. And my guess is that this is in advance of that. So deeply problematic. So if the science isn't there, and if there isn't really a rationale that can be scientifically based for these regulations, what else might be going on? One of the things, a couple of the things I think that are sort of part of this sedimented thinking that help to bolster this policy are the perceived urgency to draw a line between men and women as though this is a crisis. The myths of testosterone, some of which I've already mentioned, the proxy evidence about plausible but as yet unconfirmed theories, and something I've called before cryogenic staffing. And all I mean by that is that a series of policymakers that have been involved for a very long time who keep returning to create these policies, and who for the most part have been dismissive of the kinds of critiques that at this point have come from around the world, from various different bodies, including the World Medical Association and the UN and Human Rights Watch, and have at every turn rebuffed those concerns and critiques and analyses. So someone had asked why African women, and this is where I'm almost done. I want to sort of tie back to the beginning of the talk. There are 3 linked claims that policymakers have made that they use to sort of justify, and that also in a way narrows their focus to, it's not just women from Africa, but given our current forum and panel today, I wanted to be specific about that, but it's actually women from Asia as well. The 3 claims are this. One of them is that, and so sorry, these are taken actually from a talk that was given in 2012, right before the London Olympics, from one of the key policymakers at World Athletics. So when you see something in quotes, that's coming from him. First, a claim that there's huge ethnic and area variation in the prevalence of intersex, with the idea that there's a higher prevalence in the global South. I don't have time to go into this, but these are based on deeply problematic studies, some of them actually coming directly from South Africa that are old but keep getting circulated. And they get circulated so much that marathon runner Paula Radcliffe even mentioned these in a BBC interview about the idea that there are more women. This is absolutely not supported. But it's based on problematic studies that are still circulating. The second is sorting intersex variations according to whether they provide athletic advantage. And here what they're doing is implicitly linking this ethnic and area variation. And so the idea, once again, is the impression that people with the most advantage are clustered in the global south. And then the third idea is that there's no local expertise to diagnose and treat intersex in this area, in these areas rather. This becomes incredibly important because if we think back to the hierarchy around binary sex, there's something very important that's happened globally. In the global north, a paradigm to intervene on babies that would include surgery to the gonads, surgery to the genitalia has been in place since the 1950s. So in many contexts of the global north, you absolutely have people with intersex variations, and it's not necessarily any different than the prevalence anywhere else in the world. But what's happened is that they've been intervened upon early in life. Now, if you take South Africa and some of these studies I mentioned, what happened in South Africa, and this is a very gross sort of quick hit on this, is that the white doctors who were performing this did not perform these kinds of interventions on Black South Africans. They performed these kind of interventions on white South Africans as a way of continuing to keep that racialized sex binary and hierarchy. Okay. So again, some quotes. So what you have then are not a difference in prevalence, but a difference in the mode of intervention, where these kinds of practices that have been, that have allowed and really routinized the intervention, unwanted intervention on bodies that has been roundly critiqued by many organizations, many parts of the UN, Special Rapporteur, Human Rights Watch, Surgeon Generals of the US. I could just go on and on. The surgeries are outlawed in various countries, etc. That what is happening is this idea that these policies and regulations come from a place of medical benevolence, and that these women have been denied these appropriate medical interventions from the global north, and had they been attended to properly when they were young, they would have been intervened upon. So 2 quick quotes and then I finish up. Again, the IAAF policymaker. As I told you before, a lot of these cases arise in poor countries or developing countries where diagnosis is not done at birth, like is the case in Western countries at least. Diagnosis is not done and you realize that you have a 16 or 18 years old, very well performing athlete with an intersex condition who's going to be entered into a major championship, and here probably would be stopped. Now the here actually positions him very squarely in the global north, both in terms of the thinking, right? But also in terms of the population that he's concerned about, right? And he's worried about the African women, the Asian women coming to compete in these contexts and not having been stopped before. Please, apologies for my dog. The last one, HA here is hyperandrogenism and DSD is a synonym for intersex. So first, I'll just replace it with intersex for clarity. Oh, Abby! First, intersex is not so rare in female sports, at least athletics. So this in part explains our focus. I say at least athletics because, as you probably know, athletics is a whole world sport. It's not purely the Caucasian sports. We have a lot of people coming from Africa and Asia, and we have a lot of these cases coming from these countries. So of course, there is a kind of recruitment bias, a double one. One, because they have an unfair advantage, some of them. So of course they compete better and they reach more easily the highest level. And the other one is, I would say, an ethnic or local area recruitment bias, because they are undiagnosed at birth. So they are raised with this condition and they arrive at the highest level with these condition, which is quite seldom in rich countries where they are treated just after birth. So in order to wrap up and bring this for full circle, I wanted to include those quotes to show the ideologies that are at the root of these regulations. And really quite often we're caught at the level, and I'm often brought in to sort of explain what the science really says, but that is a diversion from the racialized, patriarchal kind of thinking that has given birth, if you will, to these policies, and what I've called elsewhere a kind of medical colonialism, with the idea that women will be punished for not submitting to this global Northwestern paradigm about normalization that has been roundly critiqued around the world, and which they fail to actually mention as they're suggesting these are benevolent interventions. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the talks and any other questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Karkazis. It has given, I think, many of us food for thought, especially since you were able to trace back for us where the origin of this whole testosterone debate started and how it has led us to this current point. So I've noticed that there are a few questions already, and we have noted them, of course, but they'll be answered or posed after our second speaker, Dr. Payoshni Mitra. So now I have the honor of introducing Dr. Payoshni Mitra. So Dr. Mitra is a former badminton player and coach, and also a prominent athlete rights activist and leading campaigner in the abolition of sex testing policies in women's sport. She has worked closely with impacted athletes across Asia and Africa to enable them to address the human rights violations that they experience in sport when they are targeted for gender verification, or in this case, testosterone verification. She's also a director and trustee at the Center for Sport and Human Rights in Geneva, and is an active member with the Women's Sport International. So from us as well, for this webinar, thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Mitra, especially seeing as you are on vacation. So I will hand over the presentation to you, and I will share your presentation as you have requested. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Nana. It's wonderful meeting you virtually, and it's always a pleasure to be with Dr. Karkazis, who I have worked with for a long time, since the time we worked with Duti Chand. In fact, before that, we first met at the time when London Olympics were taking place in 2012. That was when I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Karkazis and also Dr. Rebecca Jordan-Young, who has co-authored the book Testosterone along with Dr. Karkazis. Can I move on to my first slide? Please forgive me, because it's been a very busy time, even though I have been on holiday because of what's going on across the world, and especially on this issue. It's been quite a busy time for us. I tried to not, I talk about the history of sex testing at all, because Dr. Nana has advised me to talk about the human rights concerns connected to this issue. So I will just stay focused. So we, Dr. Karkazis and myself, we collaborated with Human Rights Watch right after Custis Menier's judgment at the Court of Arbitration for Sport was given. And we, I was part of that case as well. I was, I testified as an expert at Custis Menier's case. And once that judgment came in May 2019, we decided to do further work on this issue because we felt that the voices of women who were being directly impacted by these regulations were not really out there. And so we collaborated with Human Rights Watch, and we came up with this report in 2020, December 2020. And obviously the things that we were already talking about are very well covered in this report. And I would suggest that if you haven't yet gone through this report, you must. Next slide, please. So the kind of issues that we talk about in this report are to do with different kinds of human rights issues in connection to these regulations of the World Athletics and the kind of rights which were being violated. Privacy and right to privacy and dignity. So what we have seen, and I have worked with several athletes across Asia and also across Africa, and we have often seen that test results have been leaked, leading to a lot of public and media scrutiny and humiliation. Now, if you think about 2009, at the time of Berlin World Championships, there was a lot of media interest on Caster Semenya. And we did see a similar kind of interest in the Namibian athletes, both Christine Mboma and Beatrice Masalengi very recently. And it kind of reminded me of what was happening in 2009, was kind of repeated in 2021, in spite of us doing so much work on trying to focus on the human rights side of this issue. The other thing that we need to understand here in the context of what has been happening with current cases of athletes is the DSD regulations as it stands today. It outs athletes by design, because it is only about, the DSD regulations have specific events which are restricted. So it's between 400 meters and 1 mile that these regulations are are applicable. And what we have seen is a lot of these athletes were forced to switch events, because now you have the option, post Duti Chand's case, you have the option to switching to different events, because in 2014, when Dr. Karkazis and myself and we went with Duti Chand to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, CAS realized that there wasn't enough scientific evidence to back the regulations, the hyperandrogenism regulations, which were brought into practice in 2011. So it was suspended for a couple of years until World Athletics came back with fresh evidence, according to them, and we'll come to that. And Dr. Karkazis has already spoken about that evidence. In 2015, they came back in 2017, and finally, after Caster Semenya's appeal, after she lost that appeal in 2019, those regulations were implemented for middle distance races, and which meant that athletes in middle distance races, if they had T and therefore they were stopped from competing, they could switch to any other event. So the moment athletes switch from 400 meters to 200 meters in the recent past, what has happened is people started guessing why they might have stopped competing in 400 meters. And that's why I'm saying that the DSD regulations by design outs athletes as having a DSD. Now, therefore, it's by design, it's sort of not respecting an athlete's privacy. Right to health. So medically unnecessary interventions are being recommended by these regulations. Psychological and physical harm caused because of these regulations. Athletes have spoken about how they felt coerced, forced, trapped, as if they didn't have any options. Athletes have talked about not being informed about the consequences of these medical interventions. And when I'm talking about medical interventions, I'm talking about pharmacological intervention as well as surgical intervention. I will get into some specific examples later. Discrimination is another part. Athletes who have been facing discrimination during doping tests. It's a known fact in the sporting circuit that during doping tests there is kind of a surveillance of your physical parts. There are medical staff who are present during urine collection, and there is a scrutiny that takes place at that time. Women, whoever is different. I remember when I worked with Duti Chand, a lot of questions were raised about why she used to sort of go out in the dark, unafraid of the dark. Why she liked women. Duti came out much later, though. Why she had strides which apparently look like a man's strides. These kind of questions, how she walks, how she talks. There is this kind of a scrutiny constantly taking place in the circuit. And when I say circuit, it's the sporting circuit that I'm talking about. And there is obviously a lot of other women. A lot of these women often were told that we don't want, there's no one who wants to share your room. So these kind of things, a lot of these athletes have been facing. And obviously lives and livelihoods harmed. Once earlier, especially with the testosterone, the hyperandrogenism regulations, when there was a blanket ban, athletes had to quit or succumb to these kind of medical interventions in order to continue to compete. So at that time, we have seen that athletes had disappeared from the circuit, had no means to make any more sort of, money. So it's also sort of connected to one's rights to labor and employment. Next slide, please. Sorry, I know. Thank you, Dr. Nana. I haven't. I was just going to change my slide myself. So this is a photo which I'm using with the permission of the athlete, Annette Negis from 2019. And I'll just go into the next slide and talk about her a little. So here I question IAAFs. When I say IAAF, obviously they're called World Athletics at this point. The struggle of Annette Negis. In 2011, she ran in the World Championships. She did really well in World Championships. They collected blood samples in Daegu, and the athlete biological passport was introduced in 2012. She was about to go to Olympics. A couple of months before that, in Netherlands, she had a personal best. She had a PB, best race in Netherlands. And immediately after that, she was contacted and asked to not compete, and also asked to come to Nice in France and get tested. Now, after this, from 2012 to 2019, she disappears from the circuit. And I will use the word disappeared because this is the word used by several of the members in the IAAF, as well as their supporters. Athletes disappearing from the circuit. And once an athlete disappeared from the circuit, it's as if that she never existed. So nobody really went to look for Annette Negis. In 2019, thanks to another athlete who helped me connect with her, I could reach out to her at a time when she was working in interior Uganda, very basic jobs, hardly was getting paid, really very, suffering a lot financially, psychologically extremely down, and physically very broken as well. In 2019, she openly spoke about her experience to the German ARD eye-opening media and in an ARD documentary. And then she moved to Berlin and got asylum there. Now, what happened in between? When in 2011 and 2012, when she was asked to come to Nice, she was tested there without informed consent. She was not informed about what tests, why those tests. She was not even told about what she should do afterwards in detail. And she was not told about, she says that she wasn't aware that she was undergoing a surgery. She thought it was kind of an injection. But in Uganda, where the medical intervention took place, she discovered after the day of the medical intervention what exactly happened. She discovered that there was a surgery. And she was never told that she would need to do estrogen therapy, hormone therapy all her life. And so in 2019, when she came to Germany, she went to a doctor and she discovered that she needed estrogen. So what we see here is trying to limit an athlete's, sort of trying to reduce an athlete's testosterone to limit her ability to perform. But at the same time, we don't see any responsibility, any duty of care of the IAAF to ensure that that athlete is well after the medical intervention. They did not really care about where she was. So where is IAAF's duty of care? Next slide, please. So between 2011 and 2014, what happened is the Daegu 2011 World Championships, blood samples were taken from all athletes. This also led to a witch hunt of women athletes with high testosterone, and that's what we see with Negis. IAAF scientists published a paper about investigating and conducting invasive and irreversible surgeries on 4 young women athletes from rural or mountainous regions of developing countries, 2013. They also say rural and mountainous regions of countries with poor care, referring to poor medical care. And this you can connect with what Dr. Karkazis was talking about before me. Surgeries not for health risk, but to level the playing field. Some surgeries were advised and conducted just to level the playing field. Athletes began to disappear from the circuit unnoticed, as we see in case of Negesa. Next slide, please. Now, key points from Chand and the previous slide, please. Key points from Chand's case. I haven't really gone into detail of Chand's case today. Thank you. So we see a few things about autonomy of sport where no one else has a role to play, but sport organizations are deciding over these issues, limiting and controlling the rights of athletes. So one of the examples that I would like to give here is the WADA code and how these doping samples are taken and used for other purposes. And now in the 2020 WADA code, it includes in footnote this point that doping samples could be used for other purposes, which is a violation of an athlete's privacy right. And we can discuss this if anyone has specific questions on it. I am aware that there is not much time. Lack of transparency, accountability. We have seen this in case of Negesa as well as in Chand case where tests were done without permission, without informed consent, even before a formal investigation began. And we do have proof of that in Duti Chand's case, because one of the doctors who did that from in the Indian Federation, Athletics Federation, were interrogated in Chand's case. And it was proved that he did a USG and ultrasonography without permission and without any paperwork and without any consent of the athlete. Several factors limiting recourse to judicial mechanism in global south countries. Now, the other point that we have to understand here is the lack of judicial, legal recourse? What do athletes do if they are in a situation? Do they know? Do they know about their rights? I was asked by Dr. Nana to speak about, what can be done in the national setup. Now, we need to make our athletes aware. It might not be the first priority of the federations because they really gain from the fact that athletes are not aware of their rights. But that is what we need to have in place. We need to make sure that athletes know when their rights have been violated. They know even things like asking when they are asked to go for a test, they need to ask for something in writing. The moment you ask someone, and I keep saying this to many athletes I work with, that if someone asks you for a test, for anything, ask back and say that, can you provide that in writing? So these kind of small things that athletes need to be aware of. Lack of support, obviously, and there is a culture of subservience in sport. Sport is culturally, the way sport is structured, athletes kind of tend to be subservient. They're supposed to follow orders of the coaches, of the administrators. They're young. So we generally, especially in countries in Asia, I have noticed this, and also in some countries in Africa, noticed this, that there is this culture of subservience, and that needs to change. Lack of resources and information is also a huge, obviously, problem, which is directly connected to awareness of athletes. Next slide, please. So we have seen that, that in spite of, all these, a lot of organizations, which I would actually go later, in spite of the Human Rights Watch report, a lot of us talking about human rights issues, the IAAF maintained that it's a public authority exercising state powers, but rather it's not a public authority, but a private body exercising private contractual powers. Therefore, it is not subject to human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the European Convention on Human Rights. Next slide, please. And we see here, and this is very important for national federations and people working in national federations or local federations to know, that the World Medical Association has reiterated its advice to physicians around the world to take no part in implementing new eligibility regulations for classifying female athletes. It's very important for doctors involved in the sports sector to understand that this is the stance of the World Medical Association. Next slide. We have seen recently, in fact, in December 2020, the IOC recommendations for the IOC human rights strategy also directly discussing inclusion issues and talking about these regulations. And to be fair, we have seen the IOC taking a kind of a stance, a different stance from the World Athletics as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned. Next slide. And, we know that the UN has published a report calling for revoking or supporting regulations that pressure DSD athletes into medical procedures. So a lot of international human rights agencies are coming forward and talking about human rights violations in connection to these regulations. This wasn't happening in the beginning when we started working on this, both Dr. Karkazis and myself, but it's a welcome change that international organizations concerned on human rights issues are coming forward. Next slide. Now I'll go to something really recent. This was right after the Olympics, where Christine Mboma, a wonderful young athlete from Namibia, who won a silver medal, and it kind of, again, sort of erupted a lot of media attention. And Sebastian Coe, the president of the World Athletics, made some comments which directly, I would say, were adding fuel to the fire. And he also said that the last 30-40 meters of Mboma's race in the 200 meters in Tokyo vindicated their decision. It's strange that a president of a sport governing body could talk about their regulations being vindicated by one athlete's performance. Is that then not dependent on research that he also claimed to have? Now, if I move to the next slide, I have written a response in the Telegraph if any of you want to read that. And if I move to the next slide, and Dr. Karkazis also referred to this particular correction in her presentation, which was published yesterday, serum androgen levels and their relation to performance in track and field mass spectrometry results from 2127 observations in male and female elite athletes. This is a paper by Stephen Barman and P.Y. Garnier from 2017. And it's one of the bases to the DST regulations that were published and implemented in 2019. And it's only yesterday that in the British Medical Journal of Sport Medicine, they have spoken about this research being misleading. They were obviously scientific experts who found flaws, about more than 2 years back, but it's only yesterday that they published this correction, accepting that their research was misleading, that their research was exploratory, not confirmatory, and that more robust research is needed in order to sort of support what this research was saying. They also say that it's not causational, but it was a correlational research. So in a way, they accept the flaws in the research through this correction that was published yesterday. Dr. Karkazis raised the point that why this timing? Why after the Olympics, where Caster Semenya wasn't able to compete, for example, in spite of being the world champion in 800 meters, wasn't able to compete in Tokyo because of these rules. Now, if these rules are based on inadequate scientific evidence and they accept it now, then why were athletes not allowed to compete? And not only that, we must understand that there are several athletes across the world, and many of them I'm working with, who have been asked to take medical steps, life-changing medical decisions they are forced to make at this point. On the basis of what? On the basis of scientific evidence, which is not complete, which is just exploratory, and now they accept that it's misleading. Next slide. So I picked two questions because most of the questions were related to testosterone, really. So I had the expert, before me, so I didn't have to talk about any of them. But I picked two of those questions that Dr. Nana kindly shared with us. Who makes the rules, and is it an African problem? Now I will go into my next slide. Who make the rules? And here you see some of these people from the medical commissions, most of them from the medical commissions, the president of the IAAF, former athlete as well, Sebastian Coe, Jonathan Taylor, who represented the IAAF as their legal advisor and legal representative at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Caster Semenya's case, as well as in the Vichon's case. You have Stefan Bormann, who is the medical director and one of those authors in the paper just mentioned, which said that the research was just exploratory and misleading. So there are plenty of other people. Now, what does this picture tell you? I'll go into the next slide. It is not an African problem. It is an European problem. And world athletics, based in Monaco, one of the richest countries of the world, is the problem. Thank you. I'll just leave that quote.
Well, yes, quite an informative and thought-provoking presentation, Dr. Mitra. Thank you so much. Especially, I think the second to last slide, looking at the pictures of who are the people involved who make the decisions, which have affected so many lives. So I really appreciate that. And I know that we are a bit over time, but we did start a bit late. So for those who are still online, I do say thank you very much. And again, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Mitra. Now I will hand over to Dr. Hamutumwa, who's going to be our moderator for the Q&A session. So I think now I see quite a few questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box. So Dr. Hamutumwa, I will hand over to you for that process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nana, for the opportunity to interrogate. And let me join you, Dr. Nana, once again to thank our presenter for diving into such a very, very complex subject matter. But I think we would then obviously agree that the fundamental question of who is the problem and is Africa a problem? I think that should probably be one of the center of our discussion moving forward. Dr. Nana, you would see that there is so many questions, and some of the questions that are appearing when I was going through the list of the questions that were sent, some of them are repeating. And I wanted to give you the privilege as the host to select maybe 4 questions that we can share with the presenters, so that at least they can just discuss and give feedback to any of the 4 questions that you're going to select. So Nana, it's up to you to really select those that you think are appropriate. Thank you, Dr. Nana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamutuma. So looking at the questions that have been posed, I will jump to Nadia Gustavo. So she brings in the conversation starter with Michael Phelps. So she says, whenever this conversation comes up, I always think about Michael Phelps and how he was seen as this marvelous superhuman who excelled in sports. So whereas Custer and the Namibian athletes have an unfair advantage and are discriminated against. So what, in your opinion, is a fair and acceptable biomarker for sports governing bodies to use? And how can we prevent racial discrimination from being a determining factor in sports exclusion? So whoever wants to answer first.
Okay, I'll just jump in quickly.
From your
and then if Payoshni wants to add. I would move away from any suggestion that we have a biomarker, because what we know since the 1930s is that is not, it's very often discriminatory. It excludes women who belong in the category and who should be competing. And so, and there's no way that scientists and others could settle on any particular biomarker, not for sex per se, and certainly not for athletic advantage. So I saw a comment about genotype and other things. If you think the science on testosterone is spotty, wait till you see the science on the relationship between genetics and athleticism. It's even worse. Meaning, you know, it's not worse science. I don't mean to suggest that, but just to say that I think what happens here is people want, well, first of all, I think it's a solution in search of a problem. I don't actually think we have a problem. I don't think the women who are competing understand that there's any problem from their angle, right? The women who are actually being discriminated against or targeted. And so I loved that. If I could have cheered and stood up for Payoshni's slide with all of the policymakers, I would have, because I think it so exemplifies whose gaze is prioritized here. We don't have people from Africa standing up on their chairs demanding regulations, right? In fact, what we see is an incredible upsurge of support for the athletes. And this idea that there should be a biomarker, I think, is a holdover from the way in which embodiment has been used to justify discrimination. And that we already have other ways, legal identity, social identity. And what these regulations have said is that's not sufficient, but I've never seen a reason as to why. it's not sufficient, other than the kinds of things that we've both spoken about?
I don't have much to add to what Dr. Karkazis just said. Yes, I mean, it's time that, that's what sport authorities have done to us forever. They have forced us to try and look for that biomarker. And it's time that we go beyond that and see what they have been doing, rather than trying to find the biomarker on the body of a woman from one of our countries. What we need to really do is reverse that scrutiny and look at them and see what they are doing. So I would say, let's go beyond the question of science that we are used to asking, and reverse that scrutiny and look at these people. It was intentional to use that slide with all those men and one woman. It was intentionally used because we have always seen the photos of the athletes on our screens. We hardly see who are these men, mostly men, all white men, who are making these decisions and impacting lives of women across the world negatively, to say the least.
Thank you, Dr. Payoshni and Prof. Karkazis. My second question here is from Gracias Mbalya. The question is, I am a community coach and I wish for my participants to benefit from their natural talent. So how can I protect them with respect to their rights on this issue?
Can I take a look at the question? Is it in Q&A? Or
the question is in our chat. So
okay.
It's from, if you scroll up, it's from Gracias Mbalya. I hope I pronounced it right. It was sent at 6:54 p.m.
Community coach, and I wish my participants can benefit in their talent. How can I protect their right? It's a matter of another day's talk, I believe. But I think it's important to be aware the fact that she is attending these discussions, and to make athletes aware that we are all different. No two babies are born the same. We are all different, even if we have the same level of testosterone, we don't really run equally fast. So it's important to accept difference. It's important to know that everyone has a right. I think one of the things that I would like to mention here is when Duti Chand took that step forward and went to Court of Arbitration for Sport and challenged the regulations of an international federation, which no other athlete ever had done before. That was a huge step, but she had that audacity to do that. And each of us have that power. We in sport, we tend to look at athletes as the bottom of the pile, even though they are in some way central. We tend to not give them rights, but it's important that we give them their rights. And it's important to make them aware and, be supportive through their journey. As a community coach, I'm glad that there is a community coach who's thinking on these issues, which is fantastic. And we are always there to help anytime if there is any issues that need our support.
Thank you, Dr. Mitra. Now, this is a question, and I know it's come up more than once, and it causes a bit of confusion when it comes to the testosterone debate. So this question is from Ivy Kondwe Chinangwa. So she says, how is the issue of trans women athletes different from high testosterone in female athletes? So I know even on Twitter and on social media and in articles, it's an ongoing debate between trans women and their levels of testosterone and, intersex women or women with high testosterone in sport. So Prof. Karkazis, Dr. Mitra, could either of you shed some light on this? Just a few words.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say is that there's a tremendous amount of confusion among people, and I understand that, but also conflation between the two groups. What I think is similar is that what the sports governing bodies want is a testosterone threshold or criterion to participate in the women's category, right? This is considered the biomarker, whether one is cisgender or trans. The idea is that too much testosterone is a problem. What's really interesting about this, that I think I want to take the question in a slightly different way for a second, just to sort of show the underlying discrimination. There is a condition among women called polycystic ovarian syndrome that is actually the most common reason why women would have high testosterone. And by most common, I mean 80 to 90% of women, you know, with high T are going to have this condition. Those women are exempted from these regulations. So they can have testosterone above the threshold and still be allowed to compete. Why? Because they're viewed as normative women. And so I really loved Payoshni's comment that the key here is a kind of rigid lane in which all women are supposed to fit. Not just the women regulated, right? In terms of a particular body type, a particular gender presentation, a particular way of walking or performing or dressing, and all of these different things. So these regulations don't just harm women who are specifically targeted, they harm all women because they're based on normative gender stereotypes that in turn harm all women. But similar for the regulations that we spoke about today, there's almost no research on trans women, testosterone, and athleticism. And it's a very similar kind of smoke and mirrors around the science, and very similarly supported by normative ideas about the hormone bodies, men and women, and their differences. So while it's a distinct issue and affects different populations, some of the same kinds of thinking, I think, inform the regulations, including non-acceptance.
Thank you, Professor Karkazis. Now, I'm going to round off the final question by combining questions from Ife Ofune and Viwa Soga. So Viwa Soga says, how do we spark a broader conversation across societies about what is at the core the continued policing of women and their bodies? And then Ife Ofune says, how do we ensure fairness in sports? So what are your recommendations therefore on this? How do we regulate this? So I think in essence for the both of you, how do we start sparking a greater conversation and not being apathetic in terms of when an issue arises, then we come together and then want to do something. And then of course, what is the way forward to ensure fairness, I think. And I see that Muditambe Ravel has probably answered it slightly. She's made a comment that it's high time that athletics federations from Africa and Asia stand up and support their athletes. So I think starting from that nexus, I mean, yes, how do we get there? How do we get their support? How do we ensure fairness? So if we can have a few words, closing words from the both of you in terms of the way forward, because we want this webinar to actually galvanize and start conversations and action, not just people sitting here for 90 minutes and then discussing and learning, and then we go back home. So over to the both of you.
Shall I go first, but Dr. Karkazis? Thank you. Again, two questions. Dr. Nala, you are bringing them together. I'd like to quote Veronica Ivy, who's a professor as well as a trans athlete, and she said that inclusion is fairness, and I think that's very important to understand, that inclusion is important and it's fair to include everyone in sport. That would be my answer to your first question. The other question that you referred to about women's bodies being policed outside sport, it's extremely, I mean, as someone who believes that she's part of sport, I feel ashamed of the fact that sport actually increases in a sport through these regulations have had this impact even beyond sport, where women's bodies are being policed. And I want to talk about a couple of athletes we had interviewed in the course of, with whom I have worked as well separately, but also interviewed in the course of the Human Rights Watch research, who talked about how as young athletes, when they came to train and came to race in a competition, some people called them castrosomania, and they didn't know who was castrosomania at that time. They had to go back and look and Google and see who castrosomania was and try to understand why they were called castrosomania. Now, so obviously there is sort of, these regulations have an impact. Now, Castro is a fantastic champion, and once that particular athlete came to know who castrosomania was, she was very happy that she was called castrosomania. But obviously we know why, and I think that's something that we need to address in sport. And it's really unfortunate and sad that sport is sort of reinforcing and perpetuating these kind of behavior and policing of women's bodies, whereas sport should be doing something that's completely different. Because when we talk about women's sport, we talk about freedom of running, we talk about being completely comfortable with your body, being, it's such a wonderful experience. It's a physical experience, but sport could be such a wonderful experience for all women. It's a liberating experience for all women. But it's so sad that that very sport is, through its high performance sport and through its regulations, are leading to something like this, not only within the sector of sport, but beyond. It's unfortunate, and we need to come together to work on that. Some of us that, Ntambi Ravili is here. She's the chair of the South African Women in Sport Foundation, doing great work. And I think, there are people like her across the world who are fighting these kind of policing of women's bodies in and outside sport. Dr. Karkazis.
I don't have a lot to add. I thought that was really beautiful, and especially inclusion is fairness. We've become accustomed to thinking about fairness strictly on physiological grounds, and there are myriad ways that one could conceptualize this, including inclusion, including economic, including population size. I mean, one of the reasons China and the US win so much is because of the resources available to them, including population size and economic resources. I don't think if you had policymakers not from the global north, so from the global south and elsewhere, they would have a policy like this, because fairness is not understood, right, as being about a particular testosterone level. So to me, the key issue is to not accept the terms of the debate, right, but to actually frame it otherwise, and to understand the kinds of politics that are operating here, and that it's important that we understand that in the framing of these regulations, there's been an inversion that's been normalized about who is harmed. So the narrative that comes from the mouths of the people on the slide that Payoshni showed are that it is the white women with lower testosterone who have been harmed. But that's not correct. The women, because what are they losing at this point other than hypothetical medals? The actual material and physical harm is to the women that Payoshni's been working with, to the women that we've been, that we had interviewed, who have absolute material harm, bodily harm in the case of Annette that is lifelong, right? Or financial, economic distress or harm because of not having access to winnings, or the kinds of employment that can come with these kinds of positions of participating in elite sport. So by looking for a kind of fairness grounded in physiology, that in and of itself privileges, I would argue, a particular kind of perspective that keeps a racial global hierarchy in place and doesn't take into account notions of fairness that come from other contexts, circumstances, and people.
Thank you, Professor Karkazis, and also Dr. Mitra, for your comments on my final question. Now, before I hand over to Dr. Hamatumwa, I am going to launch a poll. I hope you can see it. So we'd just like to do some follow-up webinars, based on what we've discussed today and based on some of the conversations we've also had in private capacities and what people have sent through in terms of the questions. So whilst Dr. Hamatumwa is speaking up, if you can just vote, it's up now. So I'll hand over to him before we close our webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Nana. Thank you, Dr. Nana, for that opportunity. Strangely, I don't know what is happening with my camera, but let me steal this opportunity to say that whatever goes up must always come down. And I believe that our webinar has achieved its intended purpose. When we started to put this webinar together, our initial conversation was to really ask a fundamental question: what is that we want to achieve with this webinar? And I think ours was to create a platform that can educate, inform a broader members of society, so that when we are discussing this topic, we can discuss it intelligently and also on the point of departure where we are informed on where we are coming from and where exactly we want to go. And I want to take this opportunity really to thank Professor Katrina and Dr. Payoshni for availing yourself to provide this critical information that will spark a broader conversation through this multicultural society that we find ourselves. I cannot thank you enough for really making time to be with us over these 90 minutes. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank our colleagues that has been behind the scene to put this webinar together. And I really want to thank them for their effort. But I also want to thank the participant. I believe and hope that you have at least taken something out of this educational webinar. And our aim is that you can now go back into society and also in our communities to educate our members of our society, so that at least we can begin to inform policymakers, sport organizations, and various stakeholders that has an impact on the development of our young people on the continent and elsewhere in the world, to be respected and also to really begin to have a place where they are not chased away from this important sport called athletic. And also I just want to conclude by saying that Nana, thank you very much for hosting us. And you have done a great job for bringing a great mind to a platform. And I look forward to share greater platform with you and the University of Stellenbosch and many other progressive universities around the world, where we can now begin to put meaning to the aspiration of the African people. And I believe that this webinar has just achieved what we have, the conversation that we had shortly after what transpired to the two young ladies from Namibia. Having said that, colleagues, I wish you all the best as we continue to make our society a better place. And I think as a takeaway is that inclusiveness brings fairness. And I think that should be the message to all of us. I officially would like to close the webinar so that at least we can go back home and rest. And once again, thank you very much to our presenter. You have done an excellent job, and we look forward to work with you on this subject matter. Thank you very much, Nana, and all the best to all the participants.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamatuma. And of course, before we close as well, I know that we're not able to address everyone's questions. So for those whose questions were not answered, please may you just email them to me. You would have received an email from one of my email addresses, either my research account or my Stellenbosch account. So just send me an email and then we will forward those to our speakers when they have time to respond accordingly. And as I said, this is not the end. This is just merely the beginning. We do hope to mobilize and lobby going forward. We will put our heads together and see how we can take this process further, especially now that there was a retraction by World Athletics, and that opens up, to put it colloquially, a whole new can of worms. So we'll see what happens going forward, but there will be more discussions and more engagement with the sporting community. So thank you once again. And I don't know if our speakers want to say anything before we go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nana. Thank you, Dr. Hamatuma, and everyone else for having us over and letting us speak to, I'm sure, a wonderful audience with whom we can't, given the circumstances, we can't meet face to face. But thank you so much for all the very thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitra and Professor Karkazis. And I wish everyone else a blessed day or night, wherever you are in the world. And we will be in touch and you'll receive an email from us going forward. Take care and stay blessed. Till our next webinar. Bye.
Thank you.